So one of the things that UPMC strives to do is to increase the transparency of our value-based contracts by sharing results and also, letting people know about our value-based contracts. So we're seeking to do this broadly. So you ask why Brilinta? So Brilinta is a branded drug that's significantly more expensive than the generic clopidogrel. And it, at least in the clinical trials, appeared to have superior outcomes to clopidogrel. And yet the utilization of Brilinta might not be as much as it could be. So we entered into a value-based contract with the manufacturer for Brilinta to look at outcomes relative to clopidogrel. This was not a clinical trial where we randomized patients. We simply decided to look at outcomes in patients that were started on either of these two drugs. And with the idea to see in a real-world setting, how does Brilinta do relative to clopidogrel? So it's comparative effectiveness research, except for this is just an observational study. And so what we found was, interestingly, when we looked at our patient populations, Brilinta actually did perform better than clopidogrel in terms of having lower rates of adverse cardiovascular outcomes after it was started. So we looked at patients that were admitted for a cardiovascular event and then were started on either one of those two products, and then we followed them out to see how many of these patients had recurrent events. When you looked at who got Brilinta and who got clopidogrel, there were differences, and that's just the way the physicians chose to, or prescribers chose to use these two products. We want to share the results of our value-based contract, specifically the outcomes and information about which patients got the two different drugs. And so we've submitted those results a couple places, and in general, we have been very successful in getting things published, but that paper was rejected, as were a couple other similar papers that we wrote about outcomes from other value-based contracts. And the critique is that, well, you didn't randomize these patients, and you didn't try to make the populations the same. There are clinically significant differences, and we tried to make the point that this is not it was to describe a value-based contract. It wasn't to answer a scientific question. We're not saying that based on our study, Brilinta is superior to clopidogrel. We are just saying in a real-world setting where cardiologists and other primary care providers and other healthcare professionals decide to start one of these antiplatelet drugs in a patient who's had an adverse cardiovascular event, this is how the drug performed. And in that real-world setting, it did better. But for whatever and similarly with our other papers where we've tried to describe the outcomes associated with a value-based contract, I guess the reviewers were frustrated because they said, well, it's an unfair comparison. And we weren't really trying to compare the drug. We weren't comparing the drugs to answer, again, a scientific question. We were just saying these are the results. So we've had some discussions with some of the editors to try to improve the understanding of what we're trying to get at, and perhaps we need to do a better job of making the point that, again, this is just to describe the outcomes for a value-based contract. I hope, though, that we can get the word out for our contracts and hopefully other healthcare organizations that enter into these value-based contracts. Hopefully they will be able to find venues to publish and the results of their outcomes, and so that other payers can learn from it. I really think that the results of our Brilinta value-based contract could be very instructive for other payers who might want to do a similar contract, because the concern is that it's significantly more expensive than the generic drug, but at least the way it's being prescribed in a real-world setting, it looks like it does pretty well. I think they still are the exception and not the rule. The number of value-based contracts that any one given payer or healthcare organization have is small relative to the overall number of drugs that they provide. So it remains a niche. Value-based contracting is not the answer to controlling drug costs, but it's part of the answer. You know, it's one of the cogs in the wheel. And so, yes, it remains, these contracts remain the exception. Why is that? Well, I think first of all, they are a lot of work, at least for us. I'll speak just for us. We try to be very thoughtful when we enter into these contracts. We have lots of meetings with industry partners. Takes a lot of time to develop the outcomes and to figure out ways in which we can measure those outcomes and adjudicate them in a fair way, something that's fair to us, fair to the industry partner. One of the other realities is, though, that as of yet, there's still not a lot of risk on the table. So I'm saying that from a payer perspective, that industry still has not put a lot of risk on the table. And I think that that's also another reason why we haven't seen more implementation, because of the amount of work and the amount of potential pay. And sometimes you get nothing back because the drug does well, which is a good thing, but you get nothing back and you've put quite a bit of work into it.